You did everything right. You ran the math. You stopped eating at 8 in the evening, waited until noon the next day, and repeated that exact cycle every single morning for 3 weeks. By every conventional calorie counting model, weight loss should have been biologically unavoidable. You were disciplined. You were consistent. You pushed through the morning hunger without reaching for anything. You drank your water. You showed up every day without exception. And then you stepped on the scale. The number was higher than when you started. If you have experienced that exact moment, the specific, disorienting frustration of doing everything the science promised and watching your body do the opposite, then I need you to stay with me through what I am about to say very carefully. Because what happened to you was not a failure of your willpower. It was not proof that intermittent fasting is a myth, or that your metabolism is uniquely broken, or that this approach simply does not work for people over a certain age or a certain body type. What happened was something far more specific and far more fixable than any of that. Your body received the wrong hormonal signal. And when your body receives the wrong signal, the number of hours you fasted becomes almost irrelevant. The biological outcome flips from fat loss to fat storage. Not because you are doing something wrong with your food choices in a general sense, because you are making one or more of 5 specific identifiable mistakes that trigger a survival response your body cannot distinguish from actual starvation. Here is the thing most fitness content will never explain with this level of directness. Intermittent fasting is not primarily a calorie restriction strategy. Every person who has ever tried it and failed while treating it like one can confirm this from their own experience. The frustration you felt stepping on that scale is the evidence. Intermittent fasting is a hormonal signaling strategy. The mechanism is not the absence of calories. The mechanism is what that absence of calories does to your insulin, your cortisol, your growth hormone, and the fat-mobilizing enzyme systems inside your adipose cells. When you execute the signal correctly, you unlock biological fat-burning processes that no calorie deficit alone can access. When you make the specific mistakes I am going to walk you through today, you accidentally trigger what your body reads as a biological emergency. And when your body believes it is in a survival emergency, it does 2 things without asking your permission. It breaks down muscle tissue to manufacture fast glucose, and it aggressively stores every calorie you consume to protect you from what it believes is incoming starvation. You are suffering through all the difficulty of fasting and receiving none of the hormonal benefit. That is not a weight loss protocol. That is metabolic self-sabotage driven by a misunderstanding of the biology. Stay with me through this entire video. I am not going to give you a list of vague tips you have already heard. I am going to show you the exact cellular and hormonal mechanisms behind each of these 5 mistakes, what they do inside your body at the biochemical level, why they are so easy to make without realizing it, and precisely how to correct each one. And before we get to the list, I want to tell you something that most fasting content buries or skips entirely. The most dangerous mistake on this list, the one that is silently dismantling muscle mass, disrupting testosterone in men over 40, and creating a hormonal environment that makes fat storage almost physiologically inevitable, has nothing to do with what you eat or when you eat. It has everything to do with a specific hormonal process that happens inside your body while you are asleep. We are going to get there, but first, let's address the mistakes that are actively derailing your fasting window every morning without you knowing. Mistake number 1. Breaking your fast without realizing it. This is the mistake that catches the most people, and it catches them precisely because the things that break a fast are not the things most people assume. Most people think breaking a fast means consuming food, a real meal, obvious calories, something that clearly counts. So they are carefully disciplined about not eating during their fasting window, and then they add a splash of flavored creamer to their morning coffee, chew a piece of mint gum around 10 o'clock, or reach for a diet soda at 11, because the can says 0 calories, and they figure that does not count. It counts. And here is exactly why. Because this mechanism is the one that separates people who get consistent results from people who endure the suffering of fasting without any of the reward. Intermittent fasting works through one primary biological pathway: sustained low insulin. Insulin is your body's primary fat storage hormone. When insulin is present in your circulation, the enzyme responsible for releasing stored fatty acids from your fat cells, hormone-sensitive lipase, is actively suppressed. Fat burning is biochemically impossible while insulin is elevated. Not difficult, not slowed down, impossible. The process is gated at the cellular level. The door is open or the door is closed, and insulin is the lock. Now here is the part that almost nobody explains. Certain inputs trigger an insulin response that has nothing to do with the caloric content of what you consumed. Scientists call this the cephalic phase insulin response. Cephalic referring to the brain and nervous system. When your taste receptors or olfactory system detect sweetness from artificial sweeteners, flavored beverages, sweetened gum, flavored coffee creamers, even certain compounds in some protein supplements, your brain recognizes the sensory signature of incoming food and fires an anticipatory signal to your pancreas. Prepare to process. Your pancreas responds by releasing a pulse of insulin before a single calorie has been digested or absorbed. The hormonal response is triggered by the sensory signal, not the nutritional content. Your caloric intake is 0. Your insulin response is real. This means your 0-calorie diet soda, your artificially sweetened coffee drink, your flavored almond milk creamer, all of these can partially or fully terminate the hormonal state of your fast without contributing a meaningful calorie. You are in caloric deficit and hormonal surplus simultaneously. You are hungry, you are fasting, you are enduring the discomfort of food restriction, and your fat cells are locked because insulin just showed up in response to the taste of something sweet. You are experiencing all of the suffering of fasting with none of the fat-burning benefit. That is the definition of a broken approach, and it is happening to a significant percentage of people who believe they are executing the protocol correctly. The correction is non-negotiable and simple. During your fasting window, water, black coffee, plain green or black tea, nothing sweetened, nothing artificially flavored, nothing that activates the taste receptors in a way that triggers anticipatory insulin release. If you cannot tolerate the taste of black coffee, that is useful information about how thoroughly your palate has been conditioned to expect sweetness in everything. But it is not a reason to compromise 16 hours of hormonal work for a creamer. Adapt gradually. Your taste preferences are trainable far more quickly than most people expect. Mistake number 2. Breaking your fast with the wrong first food. This mistake destroys the accumulated hormonal work of your entire fasting window in the first 5 minutes of eating. And it is extraordinarily common precisely because the foods that cause the most damage here are the ones that American food culture has trained us to associate with reasonable, even health-conscious eating. The fruit smoothie, the granola with low-fat yogurt, the whole grain toast, the glass of fresh squeezed orange juice. All of these will produce a metabolic response after a 16-hour fast that is significantly worse than what the same foods would produce in the normal fed state. Here is the physiology that makes this true. After 16 hours without food, your muscle glycogen stores are substantially depleted. Your cells are in a state of heightened insulin sensitivity, meaning the same quantity of insulin produces a dramatically amplified effect compared to a normal fed state. This heightened insulin sensitivity is actually one of the most valuable benefits that fasting creates. Improved insulin sensitivity is associated with better long-term metabolic health, more efficient fat loss, significantly reduced type 2 diabetes risk, and more stable energy throughout the day. Your cells are primed and receptive. They are ready to absorb nutrients with unusual efficiency. But that same heightened sensitivity that makes fasting beneficial also makes your glycemic response to the first meal dramatically larger than normal. When you introduce a high glycemic food, refined carbohydrates, fruit juice, a large serving of high-sugar fruit, anything that produces a rapid spike in blood glucose, into a system that has been sensitized to respond to it with an outsized insulin reaction, your pancreas releases far more insulin than it would have produced in response to the identical food in the normal fed state. The sensitized cells absorb glucose rapidly. Blood sugar, which spiked sharply, drops sharply in response to the massive insulin clearance. Within 90 minutes to 2 hours, you are hypoglycemic relative to where you started. Your brain is generating urgent hunger signals, and you are craving carbohydrates intensely. Not because you did not eat enough, but because the glycemic roller coaster you initiated with the wrong first food is now driving your appetite completely independently of your actual caloric needs. Meanwhile, the massive insulin response you triggered at the first meal has reactivated fat storage signaling in your adipose tissue at exactly the moment your body was primed to mobilize stored fat. You converted a 16-hour fat-burning window into a fat storage setup in 5 minutes. And you will spend the next 2 hours wondering why you are desperately hungry again after eating a large meal. The research on this is consistent and practical. The glycemic response to a first meal after an extended fast is significantly amplified compared to the response to the same meal in the fed state. The first meal after the fast disproportionately shapes the insulin environment for the entire remaining eating window. No other single food decision you make in your day carries this much metabolic leverage. The first meal is the highest leverage nutritional choice of your fasting day, by a large margin. The correction. Break your fast with protein and fat. Eggs in any form. A clean protein source with minimal added sugars. Salmon, sardines, or another fatty fish. Full-fat Greek yogurt with no sweeteners. Avocado. A handful of walnuts or almonds. These foods produce a gradual, proportionate, well-regulated insulin response that extends the metabolic benefits of the fasting period into your first meal, rather than obliterating them. Blood glucose rises slowly and modestly. Insulin responds proportionately. You remain in a metabolically favorable hormonal state, while your cells receive the protein they need for muscle preservation. The difference in how you feel 2 to 3 hours after a protein and fat first meal versus a high-carbohydrate first meal is not subtle. It is the difference between sustained, grounded energy and a blood sugar crash that has you hunting for something sweet by 2 in the afternoon, while wondering whether fasting is worth the effort. Mistake number 3. Fasting on top of chronic stress. This is the mistake that explains the most genuinely confusing intermittent fasting experience. The person who follows the protocol almost perfectly. No cheating during the window, a reasonable first meal, appropriate eating hours. and still watches their waistline expand. Specifically, gains softness around the midsection while losing muscle tone in the arms and legs. A shape that gets rounder at the center while leaning out elsewhere. If this describes your experience, you are not experiencing a fasting failure. You are experiencing a cortisol problem that is wearing the disguise of one. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone, the central mediator of your fight or flight response system. In its acute, short-term form, it is essential and adaptive. Your body needs cortisol to respond to immediate demands, mobilize energy under pressure, and manage the challenges your day presents. Fasting itself induces a mild, transient cortisol increase. This is physiologically appropriate, well documented, and normally self-limiting. Researchers classify this kind of manageable biological stress as hormesis, the category of controlled stress, like exercise, that makes systems stronger and more resilient by challenging them adaptively rather than overwhelming them. The problem emerges at the intersection of fasting-induced cortisol and the chronic, sustained, low-grade psychological stress load that defines the daily reality of most driven, high-functioning American adults. The demanding career with no clear off switch. The financial responsibilities that sit somewhere in the background of every decision. The family obligations that require your presence and energy, regardless of how depleted you feel. The accumulated pressure of managing a complex, high-stakes life without adequate recovery deliberately built into the schedule. When you layer the mild hormetic stress of fasting onto a cortisol baseline that is already chronically elevated from everything else in your life, the combined hormonal load does not stay in the hormetic range. It crosses into the pathological range. And chronically elevated cortisol produces a specific downstream cascade that directly undermines every benefit intermittent fasting is working to deliver. The most immediately consequential effect is the activation of gluconeogenesis, your liver's capacity to manufacture new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources when it perceives a survival emergency. When cortisol is persistently elevated and blood glucose is low from fasting, your body reads that combination as exactly the kind of threat it evolved to respond to: a prolonged period of resource scarcity in a high-stress environment. And the biological response to that reading is to manufacture glucose by any means available. The raw material your body reaches for is not fat. Fat mobilization is a slower, more efficient process reserved for stable, low-stress fasting conditions. The raw material it reaches for first is amino acids from muscle protein. Your body breaks down your own muscle tissue, converts those amino acids into glucose through gluconeogenesis, and releases that glucose into your bloodstream. Your blood glucose rises. Your pancreas detects the rise. Insulin is released. Not because you ate anything, but because your stress hormones manufactured sugar from your own muscle mass and pushed it into circulation. Beyond the growth hormone effect, chronically insufficient sleep elevates cortisol, activating exactly the stress-driven gluconeogenesis and visceral fat deposition mechanism we identified in mistake number 3, but through a physiological route rather than a psychological one. It increases ghrelin, your hunger hormone, making the fasting window significantly harder to maintain and increasing the likelihood of breaking the fast early or impulsively. It reduces leptin, your satiety hormone, making overeating during the eating window more likely, even when you are not making deliberate poor choices. And it directly worsens insulin sensitivity, the single most important metabolic adaptation that intermittent fasting is working to produce. A single night of poor sleep can reduce insulin sensitivity by measurable amounts. Weeks of consistent sleep deprivation can produce insulin resistance that takes months of correctly practiced fasting to meaningfully reverse. Your cortisol rhythm follows a natural diurnal pattern. Cortisol rises in the 90 minutes before waking, the cortisol awakening response, to prepare your body for activity. This rise is normal and healthy. But when sleep is insufficient or fragmented, this cortisol awakening response is amplified and its timing is disrupted. You wake into your fasting window with higher baseline cortisol than a well-rested person. You enter the same morning fast facing the same gluconeogenesis risk, the same muscle catabolism risk, and the same visceral fat deposition risk as someone under significant chronic psychological stress. Except in your case, the trigger is sleep debt rather than situational pressure. The downstream hormonal consequences are functionally identical. And if you are managing both chronic stress and insufficient sleep simultaneously, which describes the reality of a very large percentage of working Americans, the cortisol environment you are fasting into every morning is genuinely working against your goals, regardless of how perfectly you execute everything else. Protecting 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep is not optional for people serious about the results intermittent fasting can deliver. It is as non-negotiable as the fasting window itself. The two are not independent variables. Sleep quality determines the hormonal baseline that the fast either amplifies or fails to overcome. Late-night screen exposure that suppresses melatonin and disrupts cortisol rhythm. Inconsistent sleep and wake times that prevent the circadian calibration your endocrine system depends on. Alcohol consumption that fragments sleep architecture and reduces slow-wave sleep. All of these undermine the hormonal environment of the fast at the root level, in ways that no adjustment to your eating window or first meal composition can compensate for. Here is the integrated picture of what correctly executed intermittent fasting, or 5 mistakes avoided, sleep protected, cortisol managed, actually produces over 6 months of consistent practice. Not in 2 weeks, not in a month, 6 months. Because this is the timeline over which the metabolic adaptations that matter most compound into outcomes that are unmistakable. You wake in the morning without the urgent, anxious hunger that used to make the early fasting hours feel like deprivation. The ghrelin rhythm that your body trained for years to spike at breakfast time has recalibrated to your new eating schedule. Your body knows food is not arriving until noon, and it is metabolically fine with that. Not because you are suppressing hunger through willpower, but because your body has learned to access its stored energy reserves cleanly and without triggering the stress response that made early fasting feel like a crisis. You are experiencing metabolic flexibility from the inside. The hybrid engine is running on its second fuel source, smoothly, efficiently, without drama.